Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book, Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. 2, because I'm a fan of punk music. And 3, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough from me right now. Let's get into the interview. A big thank you goes out to the folks at Sugar CRM for sponsoring my podcast this month. Now, Sugar CRM is the provider of the #1 rated customer experience platform, which is trusted by thousands of companies all over the world and helps them achieve high definition CX. Recently, they released their new CRM and sales impact report, which surveyed 1,000 sales professionals from around the globe on what's driving or stalling revenue and customer engagement. The report also asks a provocative question. Are companies on the cusp of a customer relationship crisis? To find out the answer, find the report in the resources section of sugarcrm.com. Now, let's get back to the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Jan Kodadek, who is digital lead for Reckitt in the sexual well-being category. She's also an ex-Googler and ex-e-commerce startup founder. Jan, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me on.
Very welcome. Now, Jan, I know that you're probably famous in your own lunchtime, but for people that are not familiar with you and your work, can you tell us a bit about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. So as you said before, I'm the digital lead for the sexual well-being category at Reckitt. And really my job is to help us connect with consumers wherever they might be online. As the world continues to move online, as consumers continue to move various aspects of their life online, as our lives are more mediated by technology. So you can think about things like social media, video calling, e-commerce, all things that have absolutely exploded in the past year. This means that our opportunity to understand our consumers has also shifted online, and our opportunity to empower our consumers around their sex life, which is what we're really about, is also moving online. So my job is to really focus in on all of those digital opportunities, all those touch points that we interact with consumers, and to make sure that we are unified, we're telling the same story, that we are representing ourselves in the way that we want to be perceived, and adding value to consumers wherever they go.
Perfect. Now, before we get into kind of that, because that's a sometimes sensitive subject kind of area, as it were, I wanted to kind of step back and ask a more sort of general sort of question. I mean, because over the last 12 months, I mean, some people talk about digital transformation. I'll be like, transformation, really. Actually, what we've actually seen is a massive shift to digital. I mean, it's been driven by necessity, obviously. And what I wanted to ask is, like, a leader in this space, because you're in right at the very kind of like part of it, at the coal face, as it were. And what have been some of the biggest lessons that you have seen emerge over the last sort of 12 months, as it were?
So I think firstly, companies are finally starting to focus on operating in a world that is digital. I think a lot of companies that have been established before sort of 10 to 15 years ago, they're organized and they operate for a world that's rapidly disappearing. And I think in some ways, businesses have kind of had their head in the sand, kind of pretending that these changes aren't happening around them. They've been under increasing pressure to change for years, but a lot of them have just simply ignored it. And the pandemic has come along and really made a massive impact on the way that people live their lives.
Mm.
It's really embedded digital into people's lives in a way that wasn't before. So you previously had some consumers that were quite resistant to various digital things, like buying things online or talking to their family over over video chat. And the pandemic has really shifted that. So this is everything from shifting from working in the office to working at home. The rapid adoption, absolutely massive adoption of e-commerce.
Hmm.
um, the pandemic has really forced some of these more resistant consumers to see new possibilities and adopt new habits. And these habits are going to stick around. The one
I
other
mean,
thing that, sorry,
okay, go ahead.
I was going to say the one other thing that I think is really interesting that isn't specifically related to digital that I've seen happen within the scope of the pandemic is that there was an absolute massive groundswell of positive action. So everything from volunteer groups to community support. And that was very, very visible. And the brands that were willing and able to be part of this positive action, and I mean action, not just talking about how, they're there for us and, we're all in it together, but actually taking action, they really stood out and they really showed their human side. Because fundamentally, we've all been in this together, and organizations are just really groups of people who've come together to accomplish something. So when these brands brought their humanity forth, and they really, you saw the people behind it trying to make a difference in the community during this time, I think those brands really stood out. And so I think that this is a really interesting theme that is coming up over and over around brand purpose and company values and things like that. And I
Mm.
think within the scope of the pandemic, um, that really came to life for a lot of brands. And then there were also a lot of brands where it really fell flat.
Right. And so if I can go back on a couple of things you said there, I mean, the first thing you said, like I don't know if the light bulb kind of went on or the spotlight got kind of like turned into people's kind of faces. But you said that there's many brands that are finally getting digital, as it were. I mean, what do we mean? What do you mean by that sort of extent? Is what do you mean? Well, I'm trying to understand the extent to what you mean there. Does that mean that almost like some brands were just um, they almost still had brochureware and they still had no interaction on there, and they're no even, and that didn't even extend to e-commerce, or kind of what are we talking about? Can you, what are you talking about that kind of getting and having their head in the stand, as it were?
So the way I like to kind of describe this is, and I actually use this as an example when I try to get some people to get it, as you said, is if you ask anyone, including people who are kind of in denial about digital, to hand over their mobile phone and to go without it for 2 days, the
Mm.
concept is crazy to them. When you then say to them, well, this is how all consumers feel about their mobile devices and about their computers and about being able to be online,
Mm.
um, suddenly a light bulb goes off and they say, oh, actually, that means that we need to be taking these changes seriously. And the changes are really, they're wide sweeping. Like, it can be anything from really small changes, small ways that people live their lives slightly differently, like rolling out of bed and checking their phone first thing in the morning, to really, really big changes where, we're suddenly, through the pandemic, for example, we're suddenly able to work remotely. All of that is mediated and enabled by technology. And if we
Mm.
didn't have that technology, obviously we would be in a much different place. But it's kind of at a point where it's undeniable. And especially with the e-commerce situation, a lot of businesses found themselves in a position where they weren't prepared to trade online, or they weren't prepared to trade online at the pace and the with the agility that was really required within the scope of the pandemic. And suddenly they were jumping through hoops to try to get themselves to a place where they could trade and could operate within this kind of new context. But I would argue that that new context that everybody's, oh, this is so new, it's actually not that new.
Mm.
I think you mentioned before, like I started an e-commerce business in 2007. Now, granted, back then everybody told me could never sell anything online.
Mm.
Amazon was just a bookstore. It wasn't scary to anybody. It's a very, very different world. But, I've always had this belief that wherever there's a possibility for technology to make our lives better, there's a real opportunity for us to grasp that. And e-commerce is a great thing because it allows people to acquire goods and acquire services that aren't immediately physically located in their geographic area, right? If you were just relying on brick and mortar stores, you'd have to actually go to the store.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing you could have talked about was this idea about brand purpose and stuff. And we've seen historically a lot of people kind of like talking about, oh whoa this and oh whoa that, and kind of like how kind of like we kind of stand for this and stand for that,
Yeah.
or don't stand for this or don't stand for that. But then actually their actions sometimes don't mirror their words. And it seems to me they've been seen a collapsing of the gap between the rhetoric and actual activity.
Yeah.
And actually that's been almost like what's the word? Kind of consumers, it seems to be that the research has been showing that consumers have been actually watching and gravitating towards kind of brands that do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it, stand for things that they count as being important. So that whole kind of idea is becoming increasingly kind of important. It's something I call stakeholder experience, because it's not just about consumers and employees, it's about kind of the world more broadly, and brand purpose is linked into that. And that's just a fascinating kind of like move. And I think something will stick because like, the other thing that somebody else said to me is like, you know what, here's the thing. It's like, this is a terrible, terrible thing that's kind of happening. But there is no doubt that another crisis will happen. And there's an even bigger crisis that is a kind of a population killer, which is the climate crisis.
Yeah.
And so many people are looking to organizations increasingly as agents of change, and almost to exercise agency on their behalf, as it were.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as I said before, organizations, companies are really just groups of people who have come together to accomplish something.
Yeah.
And, all of those people within the organization, they can make an impact, whether it be on an individual basis. But when you really add all of those people together, that's actually a huge impact that can be made. And there are tech companies that have the financial prowess of that's larger than the GDP of some small countries.
Yeah.
When you also consider what you can do with that financial power, the decisions that these businesses are making and that these organizations are making can have a huge impact. It's as simple as if you took I don't know how many people work for Google now, but there was, I think, 60,000 or something when I was there. If you took those 60,000 people and every single one of them picked up a piece of trash off the street, that would be an impact, right?
Sure.
So, I think that people are looking at organizations to have this purpose, to have this kind of these values they live by for several reasons. One is because I think, as you said before, people tend to be attracted to those kind of businesses, but I think we are, as people, attracted to people with integrity.
Right.
People who do what they say and and literally walk the talk, and they are honest and authentic. And I think that's what people are really attracted to in these businesses. And I think the second reason is that because not everybody, but a lot of people obviously have jobs, and we work for these organizations, and we want to feel like we're working for an organization that's doing a good thing in the world. And yes, of course, making money is a good thing. I personally enjoy it quite a great deal. But at the same time, you as a person are enjoying the world, and you don't want it to be completely destroyed. And it's even better when a business is not neutral about what it's doing, but is actually developing and creating some positive impact in the world, right? That's a lot more motivating than just going to work to get a paycheck.
Sure. And I think that I also wanted to ask you about was this idea that we've seen this massive shift to digital, as I said earlier. But I mean, you work for Reckitt, which is an FMCG company. I mean, and historically FMCG companies have sold their products through other kind of outlets,
Yeah,
other
absolutely.
retailers. So you're like further up the value chain and don't necessarily have that direct relationship. Well, this kind of massive shift to digital has, I guess, it introduced a very different sort of paradigm for those companies. And so, what has this massive shift to digital meant for particularly somebody like Reckitt, and particularly this sort of this, in that sort of sexual well-being kind of category, um, over the last kind of 12 months? Because that seems like it's almost like new stuff in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, we've been working on digital, broadly speaking, for a long time. Even before I joined the company, I'm only about a year and a half in. So there's
Mm-hmm.
obviously a legacy of people working on digital from various aspects well before I joined. Um, but we've really had to consider how we can reach consumers in a meaningful way online.
Right.
And there is the aspect of access, which is making sure that consumers can get our products, even again if they're not physically near a store.
Mm-hmm.
But also how we communicate with our consumers. Because, as I said before, as consumers are moving their attention online, we also have to respond in kind and move our communications with consumers online. We have to understand consumers based on the information and the data that they make available to us, which is largely nowadays online. Obviously, we do some other things, and I can talk about that a little bit later. But we're really taking more of an ecosystem approach. So
Right.
we're understanding that wherever consumers encounter our brand, we really need to be consistent and delivering value, and that those channels really need to be interconnected and easy to navigate. So consumers always know, if you get this piece of information over here and it inspires you, here's the next place for you to go to deepen that inspiration or to deepen that learning.
Mm.
Ideally, we want to offer a seamless and a personalized experience, but this is always dependent on what kind of data we can gather on our visitors,
Yeah,
right?
I mean that's interesting, because the other thing that I been thinking about, least recently rather, is the idea of, we find ourselves in a particular environment where we've had, you know, rightfully so, sort of physical restrictions based on the health impacts of the obviously of the pandemic. Um, but that's caused challenges around how do we build better understandings of our customers. Because people would, traditionally would be able to either hang out and go and observe, or invite people into sort of like focus groups or kind of whatever it might be, right? So you end up with this physical sort of bit, even if it was behind a one-way mirror or kind of whatever.
Yeah.
But that's no longer really an option. And so my question I was going to ask is that, with this enforced set of, I feel like, albeit temporary restrictions, what have you guys been doing to sort of overcome those sort of challenges, and also then build your understanding, kind of a better understanding of your kind of customers, so that you get more aligned with them and build this sort of insight in things?
So that's a really great question. So we've been doing a lot of the things that we've traditionally done. We've just moved them online.
Right.
And we do still run focus groups. We do still do consumer research, everything from surveys to, we do a lot of testing on our websites and our digital channels to really kind of understand what those signals are telling us. But it's just moved online.
Right.
And it's really interesting because during the pandemic, people's sex lives changed quite dramatically. And I don't want to go too deep into it because that's probably a topic for another day.
Well, could I have a parental consent kind of 18 kind of
No,
like?
it's not even racy like that. It's just I think people always expected that with the pandemic, with these lockdowns, people would be having more sex, right? Because opportunity. But then they don't realize that maybe you're stuck at home with your kids, or maybe you're stuck in a very small space.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe your sex drive is cratered because we're in the middle of this insane pandemic and the world is very uncertain. Maybe, one of the things that I think a lot of couples encounter, but it's not in your face, is a discrepancy in sex drive, right?
Right.
Suddenly one partner wants sex more often than the other. Now, normally that would be mediated by all the other stuff you have going on in life, right? But when you're suddenly stuck together 24 hours a day for, 6 months or something, that can really come to the surface.
Mm-hmm.
So we were doing real time research and real time understanding of our consumers, and really trying to understand how the pandemic was affecting people. Because what we didn't want to do was create communications that made people feel pressured, right? What we wanted to do was do two things. We wanted to make communications where people felt understood and empathized. And then the second thing is we wanted to encourage people to follow the guidelines and to be safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we didn't want people to go out and meet somebody off Tinder and have sex with them, because while that might have been great for our brand, that would have been really bad for spreading coronavirus. And so there was a really amazing opportunity to encourage people to explore masturbation, for example, something that's always kind of been off in the sidelines, hidden in the dark. But now this is an opportunity for people to really explore themselves, and to do it in a celebratory way, in a way that's not, feeling ashamed or feeling like it's an unusual thing.
Sure.
We had an opportunity to normalize an aspect of sex that's always been a little bit shoved off in the corner. So, we spent a lot of the pandemic, especially the early days, really trying to understand where people's heads were at and what their experiences were. And then to make sure that our communications were resonating with people's reality and not just what was right for our brand, right?
Yeah. I mean, because you don't want to, as you say, you want to be sensitive, but you don't want to be kind of like pushy, and you don't want to feel like you're just flogging people kind of like product. You don't want to make them feel kind of inadequate, depending on the kind of where they're at, as you say, with their kind of like sex drive and things. But I guess the thing that wraps around all of that is that's incredibly personal and sensitive data. And that's kind of like, understandable given the category that you're in. I mean, and that's a really deep level of trust that you've got to build with kind of people. So how have you gone about sort of managing kind of that? Is that really all about the communication?
So it's another really good question. I think it's tricky because for any business to do a really great job of serving consumer needs, we need to understand deeply what those needs are, right?
Mm-hmm.
We need a real grasp on people's realities. But in a sensitive category like sexual well-being, understandably, people don't exactly want to tell you all the details about their sex life, right? So we have to try to learn about them in other ways. And as I said before, we do a lot of research, focus groups, even getting out and just talking to people about their real life experiences and challenges helps us understand people better. But I think there's a real commitment to making sure that we collect as much relevant data as possible, but that we also make sure that we're using that data to deliver a true value exchange, something really valuable to our consumers. Now, I think delivering a really great customer experience may become even harder in the future, because it's really predicated on having that information and that data to know and deliver those personalized experiences. And if it becomes harder and harder to gain that information, which with the sensitivity right now about personal data and what are brands doing with it, et cetera, it becomes harder to personalize those communications and those aspects. Like, we as a business, we are very committed to delivering the best value to our consumers. But if we don't understand what you need, then it's really hard for us to make the right products or to share the right information, education, inspiration, etc. I think that data collection and the whole what do you do with data thing has a very bad PR problem right now. And I think we as businesses and as a community of marketers and as a community of experience designers, et cetera, that we need to be thinking about how we help consumers understand that allowing us to have some of their data will allow us to better serve their needs. And I like to take the example of remarketing. Maybe you went on a website and you booked a trip to Cancun, right?
Yeah.
But then suddenly after that, you constantly see all of these ads trying to get you to book a trip to Cancun and with hotels and flights. And it's really annoying because you've already booked it. It's why is this company nagging me about something I've already done? Well, that happens because there's a discrepancy in the connections between those two pieces of data, that you were interested and that you made a purchase, right? The better customer experience would actually be serving you a selection of things you could do on a holiday, or getting you excited about your holiday, or trying to sell you, I don't know, swim shorts,
Sure.
right? Rather than, having that discrepancy. And I think we need to help consumers understand that there is a benefit for us having that data, and that, protecting that data at all costs. Yes, there's a lot of complexity around this topic, and I don't want to make light of it, but I also think that we need to do a better job as a community, getting consumers to understand what we do with that data. And we also need to be delivering a better value exchange. We need to be showing consumers that giving us that data means that they're going to get a better experience.
And do you think there's an opportunity to actually kind of like, rather than just kind of hoovering up data, but actually to be building a more of a partnership model with kind of consumers around the data that gets kind of shared, and what's the most kind of poignant sort of like stuff? Because otherwise it feels like there's a lot of data that gets collected, and then there's a lot of inferences kind of made, and then it's a bit like somebody's going, if I shoot 5 shots, kind of like, then I'll maybe hit one target sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that feels kind of like incredibly inefficient. Whereas actually, if you kind of spoke to many consumers, if you almost just ask them, it's just like, tell us what you want, kind of simply, then actually, and if you hold us to that and we deliver against that, then actually then you end up with now we're on step 1 of the trust ladder, and then you keep going, and then you ask for a little bit more, and then you go do a bit better, and then you go step 2 of the trust ladder, and then it goes on from there.
Yeah. So I think you just very elegantly said what I was trying to say. You just did a way better job of saying it. Yeah, that's exactly what I mean, is that firstly, I absolutely disagree with the mass hoovering of data. Like, we just don't need to do that. Not only do we not need to do that from a privacy perspective, but we also don't need to do it from a data storage perspective. Why are we, what are we doing with all this data? And we have to pay for all, storage and protection. If we just collected the data that we were actually able to utilize to create a really great customer experience, and we communicated to consumers that allowing us to have that data is going to give them a better, more unique, more personalized, more seamless experience, that we are going to make their lives easier, that we're going to make the experience more enjoyable, I think they'd be very happy to give us selected pieces of data, right? I'm very happy to give my email away if I'm interested in somebody's email list, but I have to be confident that what I'm going to get in my inbox isn't just going to be a lot of spam.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, you think of all sorts of simple kind of like, examples where somebody's kind of like, they have a preference for a particular kind of brand, or kind of like retailer, or kind of whatever, and they might kind of like habitually kind of like shop them for certain things, like, traditionally, kind of like many people know about like Marks and Spencers in the UK, and they've gone, some people have gone, although I hasten to add, I've never done this, but some people go, I always buy my underwear from Marks and Spencers, right? That's a very traditional thing. But if that's your thing, if that's your kind of like your groove, and if you almost like move it to digitally, we know that you do this, therefore here we've got some new kind of varieties in that sort of thing. Here's a link, it takes you straight through to it, rather than actually kind of arriving on a website and going, now I got to try and find the stuff that I want. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's a bit like going, oh, there's the value trade-off. Is like going, you're making it easy for me to get to what I kind of need to get to. And then you go, is there anything else you want? And then you can then shop around. But it's almost like the job's to be done type of idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think navigation is one way to look at it, getting people to what they want. But in order for us to get you to what you want, we need to understand what it is that you want.
But yeah, no, indeed. And sometimes it can
be as simple as, and we can't, we'll try to guess, as you said, with the pew, 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 like we'll try to guess, but that isn't really empowering us to give you the best experience and to get you exactly where you want to be. And it doesn't mean that we're going to stop you from getting to anything else. It's just trying to shortcut the process and make your navigation a little bit easier.
Yeah, no, completely. So, Crumbs, within all of this, the last 12 months must have been a bit of a whirlwind for you both from a product innovation, digital sort of like tool building, kind of communication, community understanding, all of these different sort of things. And not just, that's just the stuff. And then there's kind of like how we operate as an organization and as a team and everything else. I mean, what are some of the biggest lessons that you've learned? I mean, particularly as a leader in the digital sort of space that you'd like to pass on to other people that are in a similar sort of space, just like sharing your experience. Like, here's some stuff that I have learned, and I think this would be good value for other people to hear.
Yeah, no problem. So, I mean, I hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but firstly, digital can no longer be an afterthought. It can't just be something that you plunk on Frankenstein style to whatever else it is that you're doing. It really needs to be at the core of your initiatives. And I think to a certain degree, that also means that certain businesses may have to rethink their business model. They may have to really take a hard look at their business and say, are we actually delivering value in the current state of the world? Or are we actually delivering value for a world that existed 10 years ago or 15 years ago, 20 years ago? I think one of the reasons why tech businesses, for example, were able to shift so seamlessly to operating remotely is because they built their business around digital. And that's easy for newer businesses to do because they don't have the legacy. So I don't want to sound insensitive to anyone's struggles, but I think we just don't have the capacity to make excuses anymore. And businesses that continue to make excuses and continue to not really grapple with this topic are just going to end up being blown out of the water by the businesses that do grapple with this topic. And grapple is the right word. I don't necessarily know that it's always easy. Sometimes it is it is really like a hard look at the business and saying, are we fit for purpose for the current world? Another thing I would say is you need to make digital everyone's job, right? My analogy I gave you before is, for those who don't think it's important, just ask them to hand over their mobile phone for a day and see how they feel about it, right? You have to say that's consumers, that's the world we live in. You can't deny that digital is an important thing if actually your entire life is also reflective of these trends. It's inescapable. So let's stop acting like it's something that can just be ignored. As I said before, we need to do a better job of helping consumers really understand the value of making their data available. And we need to do a better job of offering real value in exchange for that. What else? And I think coming back to the point about purpose is that purpose is really important. And I think, we're going to see this coming to light a lot more. But I think it needs to be authentic. I think you need to get to know your employees and what's important to them, get to know the communities that the business operates in, and then find something within the scope of that is really true to what everyone cares about. That was one thing that always stuck with me from working at Google, is that it is very much an employee-driven business. And the things that employees care about and the things that impact employees' lives are topics and causes that Google as a company will throw its weight behind. And the weight of Google can be very meaningful, I'm sure you can imagine.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess, but the thing is, I guess the other thing that you've got to kind of counterbalance that with is that not everybody's going to get it right all of the time.
Absolutely.
And Google right now have recorded some missteps in various kind of things. But that's sort of a function, not necessarily doesn't make them kind of overtly kind of like bad and terrible. It's just that they're trying to figure some stuff out, and the fact that they're trying to tackle some of this sort of stuff, they're on the leading edge. It doesn't mean to say they're going to get it kind of right every kind of time. And I think this is we've got to hope, and I guess that they're going to get it right.
Yeah, I mean, look, Google is a very, very big business, and it's much bigger than it was when I even worked there, so a couple of years ago. And I think you're absolutely right. Businesses are not always going to get it right. And I think the more people you have involved in a business, the more complex it becomes, because the more people, the more viewpoints on, and the more, different commitments that people bring to the table. So I do think it is complicated. But Yeah, I think you got to put the effort in. You've got to try. And I think, sometimes there are going to be conflicting, um, trying to think of the best way to explain it, but like conflicting commitments,
Hmm.
right? So maybe there's one commitment on the side of data integrity, and on the other side is a commitment to us to interpreting that data in a way that brings out meaningful results. And those two things could be in conflict. I'm just
Hmm.
making that up. It's just
Sure, sure. No,
I'm
no, I understand what you mean.
but I think, yeah, like, sometimes there are some areas as well. Like, we live in a world where the world itself needs to take a good hard look at where we're at, and we need to deal with some of our diversity issues, and we need to deal with some of our equality issues and our equity issues. That's something that's never going away.
No.
Well, I mean, I should say, I hope it goes away. I hope it's something that, I get to see end in my lifetime, but I think it is
Hallelujah.
something that we are going to be grappling with for some time. And it's important for us to take those things on and to really, to really work on them.
Perfect. Um, so, Jan, is there anything else that you'd like to add or highlight that we've missed out before I ask you my two research questions at the
No,
end?
I think I've talked long enough for you.
So, as I explained before we started, is that I've been doing. I still haven't figured out whether it's the right way. I'm doing longitudinal research. I think that's right. I don't
Yeah.
know if it's a panel because or not. But anyway, what I'm
Super
doing is I'm
focused
asking kind of
one over
people a
here.
couple of questions at the end of these interviews to try and get their view on what a punk approach to customer experiences would look like or would feel like, based on the book that I published, kind of Punk CX. Now, fascinatingly, I actually tallied up a number of words that I've collected, and I've actually got over 100 of them, which shows that it's such a broad church, which is brilliant. I will kind of like publish that at some point. But the first question I wanted to ask was, what one or two words would you use to describe a more punk approach to customer experience?
Oh, I'm so excited that you actually decided to give me two words, because as you can see, I am not exactly the most concise person. And I did have one word, but then as we've gone through this conversation, I kind of thought actually maybe it's a different word. So I'm going to give you both of them. The first one is impact, and the second one is empathy. And I
Perfect.
think, you know, uh, for me, I think customer experience is very much about making an actual impact for customers and not just doing things for the sake of doing things, but actually having a successful outcome. And the second thing is about empathy. So I think it's really getting under the skin of what consumers challenges are, what the reality is. I'm a consumer, you're a consumer. Of course we want businesses to do this, right? That's one of the things we want, is businesses to make our lives easier.
Mhm.
And in order to do that, I think you really need to have authentic empathy.
Perfect. And second question is, what brand or company do you think epitomizes that sort of punk experience kind of ethos?
So I would love to name a business like Uber, because I actually think they're very innovative when it comes to the end-to-end customer experience. But I think, to your point before about Google, they really struggle with some PR angles, and they're a fairly controversial company when it comes to working practices and things like that. So
Hmm.
for me, very much, to epitomize a punk CX ethos, you really need to have both things. You need to have impact and empathy. So this may be a slightly boring choice, but maybe not as experiential as some other brands, but I chose Dove. And
Okay.
I think that Dove is a brand that is truly focused on the consumer's reality as it is today. But
I
they're
love the
also
fact that
trying
you
to,
kind of use all sorts of different types of women,
yeah,
different kind of like all sorts of different types of women in their advertising, and they were one of the first cosmetic healthcare sort of like well-being related kind of brands that were going like, we're all over that. That's all about what we're all about.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love their Real Beauty campaign, which,
Mhm.
is actually really looking at how, like the reality of women, that we all come in different shapes and sizes and hair colors. And there's a huge and immense pressure on women to look a certain way. And that's become even more challenging and even more strong since social media kind of took off. And I just love what they're doing around body confidence, around this idea of real beauty, but also a commitment to diversity, right?
Mm.
And they're really committed to showing real women of diverse races, of diverse body types, different ages, etc., in their marketing. And they put their action and money behind their talk. So a few years ago, they sponsored a diversity initiative with Getty Images, where they took hundreds and hundreds of photos of diverse models for stock photography. And they basically made that available through Getty's catalog. And they've been used by thousands of businesses now. They recently announced an initiative where they're actually paying brands to use diverse models in their marketing, right? So if that's not literally putting your money where your mouth is, I
But
don't
they're
know.
paying other brands to do that.
Yep.
Wow.
Exactly. What they're basically doing is they're paying the model appearance fees. So if you choose to book one of Dove's diverse models in one of your ads or in one of your marketing campaigns, they will pay the model appearance fees. So, in essence, it's getting free models into your advertising. But I love that. I think it's they are truly focused on consumers' realities. They don't have their head in the sand about it, but they're also committed to operating as a sustainable business.
Yeah.
And they're making an impact in the world. And I think, they manage to do all of those things at the same time, right? They're committed to the revenue, but they're also committed to making a positive difference in the world.
You know what? That is not boring. It's the furthest thing from boring
Oh, good.
I've heard all afternoon.
I'm sure Dove will be calling me and saying,
No, because actually, you know
boring.
what? Here's the thing about that is like it's taken conventional wisdom and it's just gone, I'm going to rip it up and I'm kind of like, it's not the way the world that gets portrayed, but the way the world that is.
Yeah, it's honest.
And what they're doing is they're going, we're going to put what is right to the forefront and then actually celebrate kind of like difference and beauty and all of its kind of like in all of its different dimensions. And that, excuse my kind of like language, is an FU to kind of everybody else that wants to paint it in a different sort of way. So definitely not boring, definitely punk. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
So that felt like the end of it, but it's not quite the end. Just wanted to say officially, thank you for that. Thank you for sharing your time and your expertise and your insight kind of with us, and also telling us the story about Dove and some of the stuff that they're doing, particularly because I think that's cool. That's proper cool. I love that. And yeah, just kind of, Jan, thank you so much for today. I mean, that's been cool.
It's been my pleasure. Really, really enjoyable.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. One final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.